From dominating the MMA world for decades to having the best referees on the block, I'm here to tell you why the UFC puts Bellator to shame. Let's face it, the UFC has dominated the MMA world for decades. In this tale of two giants, the UFC stands tall as the undisputed league, while Bellator lags behind as a small promotion. If we really get down to it, then the UFC, with its global dominance and established legacy, outshines Bellator in every way. It's like comparing a heavyweight champ to a punch-drunk amateur no contest. It's obvious that the UFC is the older and larger promotion, boasting a wider range of weight divisions and holding more events throughout the year. While the UFC is owned by Endeavor Group Holdings, a major player in the sports and entertainment industry, Bellator struggles to gain recognition under the ownership of Viacom CBS, but don't be so quick to dismiss it yet. It's not that Bellator's got nothing to offer. If you're a UFC fighter, you can't really do much else. The best thing about Bellator is the chill contracts that allow fighters to compete in other promotions. That's why you won't see a UFC star like Israel Adesanya fight in another company. And while some Bellator fighters sometimes fight in Rizin or in Russia, the best thing about the UFC compared to Bellator is that its fighters are better. Most of the best boxers in the world compete in the UFC. Come on, just look at how ESPN's top 10 pound-for-pound champions in MMA are all from the UFC. That's got to count for something, right? You're probably wondering, okay, then why do fighters choose Bellator over the UFC if they're so great? Well, it's simple, really. Fighters in both promotions are always moving back and forth. I'll be honest, Bellator has managed to get some great fighters in the past, like Aaron Pico and AJ McKee. Some end up going to the UFC and doing well there, like Michael Chandler and Eddie Alvarez. But there are also times when top-ranked UFC fighters move to Bellator instead. People like Chris Justino and Benson Henderson, who used to be UFC winners, now fight in Bellator. Now, why would anyone choose to leave the oldest MMA promotion in the world for Bellator? To understand that, you'll have to look at how the money works in both promotions. The UFC can pay better, and probably why it has more champions. It has bigger and richer sponsors than Bellator, and also gets more money, especially since it's got pay-per-view events every month. Apart from advertising money, fighters can also get post-fight bonuses that start at $50,000. But Bellator can still pay its top stars at a level that's competitive. Fedor Emelianenko and Patricio Pitbull make $300,000 and $200,000 for each fight, and fighters also have more freedom when it comes to getting sponsors through Bellator. Bellator fighters can sign with any sponsor, while UFC fighters have to stick to the companies the promotion gives them. This means that Bellator fighters can make way more money. Plus, there are also events on the Bellator schedule where the winner gets a $1 million prize. Now, I don't know about you, but I've never heard of the UFC doing that. Still, the organizations are more or less the same when it comes to following unified MMA rules. Things like eye pokes and low hits are against the rules in both Bellator and UFC. Each round lasts 5 minutes, and there is a 1-minute break between rounds. There are 3 5-minute rounds in non-title fights, and 5 5-minute rounds in title fights. The only exception is that the UFC has made many fights that aren't for a title, like major events, a 5-rounder. Bellator has recently started doing the same thing in their playoff matches. The difference comes in the form of weird weight classes and customized MMA rules in Bellator. But let's face it, when it comes to standardization and the prestige of a unified system, the UFC reigns supreme. While the UFC is big on strict drug testing protocols, through its partnership with the United States Anti-Doping Agency, I'm pretty sure everyone remembers the time Lance Armstrong was publicly caught and charged by USADA. USADA makes random visits to the UFC, and any fighter who wants to participate has to join the testing pool. John Jones and TJ Dillashaw even had to give up their titles once. Bellator is way chiller in this department. Scandals of PED used by Bellator fighters continue to surface, tarnishing the sport's integrity. It's a battlefield where the juiced warriors of Bellator seek to gain an unfair advantage. As far as standardizing cage sizes is concerned, the UFC wins that one. The size and form of the cages are another big difference between Bellator and the UFC. The size of the cage also affects how quickly a fight ends, if it ends at all. Bellator only has one cage. It's 36 feet wide and has a fighting area that's 1,018 feet large. Sure, this is more than 25% bigger than the UFC, which is good for fighters like Michael Page, who uses long-distance strikes. But the UFC offers two different types of cages. Both have 8 sides, so they're called the octagon for short. The regular cage, which is usually used for pay-per-view events and big venues, is 30 feet wide and has 746 square feet of room inside. The smaller one is 25 feet wide and takes up 518 square feet of space. Most grapplers and clinch fighters like the octagon's 8 sides because they can use them to corner their opponents. When it comes to betting, Bellator has one clear edge over the UFC. Their underdogs are more likely to win. The betting lines for Bellator tend to start later because odds makers have a harder time putting a limit on the fighters, especially ones who are new or not well known. Because of this, there are more wins in Bellator. If you like to bet on losers, then this probably makes you happy. But people who like to stack favorites should be careful. Only 8 of the 24 UFC events in 2022 have been profitable for underdog bettors. Just look at how outsiders have done well in 7 of the 13 Bellator events that happened in 2022. The reason for this is that losers can win in Bellator, but betting with UFC is way better overall. One reason why the UFC could also be a better way to make money is that it has a lot of options. This gives the UFC a major edge over Bellator because fans have more ways to bet on the company. Moneyline bets and round totals tend to start later than UFC props. Most of the time, these props are about how a fight will end, in what round, or if it'll end in a decision. Bellator doesn't have many props, and when it does, they open late and are only up for a short time. Depending on the fights, the limits on how much you can bet may also be smaller. So when do the lines for betting come out? Well, there are many different odds for both Bellator and the UFC that can be found online. The first is when the odds are made public. Most of the time, the UFC has its lines out earlier. Some UFC fights have odds posted days after they are announced, even if there's no set date. This doesn't happen to Bellator very often. The odds for this show are usually posted 2 to 3 days before the event, during the week of the fight. One reason for this is that Bellator's athletes aren't as well known as UFC's, especially on the preliminary card, so it can be harder to get a good sense of how the fight will go. The octagon needs a skilled and knowledgeable referee who can ensure fighters' safety and enforce the rules. The UFC takes the cake here as well, employing some of the best referees in the business. On the other hand, though, Bellator has a history of questionable refereeing decisions, compromising the integrity of the fights. When it comes to judging and scoring fights, the UFC has a standardized system that emphasizes fair and accurate decisions. Bellator's judging has been inconsistent, with questionable calls, and the occasional display of absurdity. It's like comparing a seasoned referee to a bumbling amateur. Based on everything so far, it looks like while they might be similar in some ways, their differences can mean a lot, especially when it comes to betting. Using the same rules doesn't make them the same at all. The octagon is way different and can completely change how fights go. The standardization and drug tests make the UFC look more solid for fighters. That's why the UFC has a lot more athletes than Bellator, more than 3 times as many. Even though Bellator's got some stars and top fighters, there's no doubt that for now, the UFC has the best athletes overall. So from having the best referees in the business to dominating the MMA world for decades, that's all for why UFC puts Bellator to shame.